It happened quietly, the way moments of real tension usually do. No crowd, no cameras, no audience waiting to be impressed. Just a private training space in Los Angeles, early 1972, a large hardwood floor room used for conditioning, movement drills, and sparring away from film sets and publicity. Bruce Lee had been training there regularly while preparing for upcoming projects, refining ideas that would later appear on screen but were never designed for the screen. This was where concepts were tested honestly, without choreography, without performance. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was there as a student, not a celebrity. At the time, he was already one of the most dominant athletes in professional sports. 7 feet 2 inches tall, elite conditioning, extraordinary reach, coordination far beyond what his size suggested. He had taken an interest in martial arts not as a hobby, but as a discipline that demanded precision and control. Bruce respected that immediately. Kareem wasn't there to show off. He listened, he asked questions, he trained seriously. The contrast between them was extreme. Bruce Lee stood barely 5'7", lean, compact, every movement economical. Kareem towered over him, limbs long, frame built for leverage and reach. Anyone watching for the first time would assume the physical difference alone made certain techniques unrealistic. That assumption was common. Bruce had heard it his entire life. Size versus speed, reach versus precision, theory versus reality. They were working on timing drills, controlled attacks and counters designed to test distance, reaction, and perception rather than power. Bruce demonstrated a fast lead hand strike, stopping just short of Kareem's face, not touching, not snapping, just placing the fist exactly where it would have landed. Kareem nodded, studying it. He understood angles. He understood spacing. In basketball, he had built an entire career on controlling distance. "I think I could block that," Kareem said casually. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a challenge. It was an honest assessment from a man who had spent years using his reach to deny access to space. In his world, long arms solved most problems. Bruce looked up at him, expression calm, almost amused, but not dismissive. He had heard that statement many times before, from men smaller than Kareem and from men far less disciplined. "All right," Bruce said. "No debate, no explanation, just acceptance." They adjusted positions. Kareem raised his arms, elbows slightly bent, hands open, ready to intercept. His wingspan alone covered an enormous area. Anyone relying on straight-line speed would have had no chance. Bruce didn't change his stance, didn't lower his center dramatically, didn't signal anything. He stood relaxed, breathing steady, eyes focused not on Kareem's hands, but on his center of mass. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then Bruce moved. The movement itself was almost impossible to describe afterward because those watching didn't register it as a sequence. There was no visible wind-up, no shoulder roll, no preparatory shift of weight that Kareem could read. Bruce's lead hand didn't travel toward its target in the way most strikes do. It simply appeared where Kareem's face had been a fraction of a second earlier, stopping with absolute precision less than an inch from his nose. No contact, no impact, just placement. Perfect, undeniable placement. Kareem reacted on instinct. His arms moved exactly as trained, sweeping inward to block space that, according to his perception, Bruce's hand should have been occupying. But by the time his hands closed, there was nothing there to intercept. Bruce had already withdrawn, standing relaxed again, feet unmoved, posture unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. The entire exchange had lasted less than a second, but it left Kareem blinking, trying to reconstruct the timing in his mind. "Again," Kareem said, more focused now. This time, he adjusted. He lowered his center slightly, widened his stance, brought his hands closer together to reduce the gap. He wasn't underestimating Bruce anymore. He was actively solving a problem. Bruce nodded once, acknowledging the adjustment, and waited. No rush, no pressure. He allowed Kareem to settle fully into readiness, understanding that the lesson meant nothing if it relied on surprise. Bruce moved again. The second strike was even harder to perceive. Kareem later described it as absence rather than motion. One instant Bruce was still. The next, Kareem felt air move across his face, a subtle displacement, like someone snapping a towel nearby. His hands closed reflexively, faster than most human beings could react, yet still too late. Bruce's fist had already stopped in position, perfectly aligned, perfectly controlled, again without contact. Kareem exhaled slowly, a habit from years of competition when something unexpected disrupted rhythm. He wasn't frustrated. He wasn't embarrassed. He was recalibrating. In basketball, when someone broke a defensive scheme, the response wasn't denial, it was adaptation. He raised his hands higher now, almost chest level, elbows tighter, preparing not just to block, but to feel the movement early. "I'll watch your shoulder," Kareem said, thinking aloud. Bruce smiled faintly, not because the idea was wrong, but because it was already outdated. The third demonstration wasn't faster. It didn't need to be. Bruce changed distance instead. He stepped half an inch closer before striking, reducing travel time to almost nothing. When his hand moved, Kareem's eyes never caught it. His brain received the result before it received the signal of motion. His block came after the fact, closing space that had already been vacated. Bruce stepped back and lowered his hand. Silence filled the room. Kareem stood there, arms still raised, then slowly let them drop. The realization settled not as shock, but as clarity. This wasn't about strength. It wasn't even about speed in the way most athletes understood it. It was about timing, efficiency, and the elimination of unnecessary intention. Bruce wasn't beating Kareem to the block. He was operating before the block existed as a decision. Kareem finally nodded. "I didn't block it," he said quietly. Bruce met his eyes, completely calm. "That's because you tried to react," Bruce replied. "I didn't give you time to choose." Bruce didn't lecture immediately. He never did when the lesson was still forming in the other person's mind. He waited, letting Kareem sit with the experience long enough that explanation would connect, instead of bounce off. Around them, the gym had gone quiet in that particular way athletes recognize, not awkward silence, but attentive silence. The kind that means everyone present understands they just saw something that didn't fit inside their usual framework. "You're reacting to motion," Bruce said at last, voice steady, almost conversational. "But motion is the end of the process, not the beginning." He gestured lightly, not reenacting the strike, but outlining an idea in the air. "By the time your eyes see my hand move, your brain is already behind. Vision is slow. Choice is slower." Kareem nodded slowly. He was used to breaking plays down frame by frame in his head, analyzing footwork, angles, timing. This felt similar, except the gap was smaller than anything he had ever dealt with on a court. "I wasn't late because I'm slow," Kareem said. "I was late because I was waiting for permission to move." Bruce smiled at that. "Exactly." He explained that most people, even elite athletes, rely on cues that are easy to notice but expensive in time. Shoulder rotation, hip movement, muscle tension that becomes visible only after commitment. Bruce trained himself to act earlier, at the level of intention, a breath pattern changing, a subtle shift of balance, a moment when the mind decides before the body follows. That was where his speed lived. Not in muscle, but in timing. "To you," Bruce continued, "it feels like speed. To me, it feels like arriving early." Kareem absorbed that in silence. He thought about shot blocking, about how the best blocks didn't come from jumping higher, but from reading the shooter before the ball left their hands. The angle of the elbow, the rhythm of the dribble. The moment the shooter believed they were open, he realized Bruce was doing the same thing, but at a far more compressed scale. "So if I can't react," Kareem asked, "what should I do?" Bruce stepped closer, not to demonstrate, but to reduce distance in a way that felt instructive rather than confrontational. "You don't wait," he said. "You remove choice. You position yourself so that the opponent's options collapse before they exist. Then there's nothing to block." He emphasized that this wasn't mystical and it wasn't exclusive. It was the result of thousands of hours refining efficiency, stripping movement down to what was essential and discarding everything else. No wasted tension, no extra steps, no intention that leaked outward before action. Most people broadcast what they're about to do, Bruce said. They don't know they're speaking. Kareem exhaled again, slower this time, and I was listening with my eyes. Yes, Bruce replied, and I wasn't speaking to them. There was no triumph in Bruce's tone, no sense of victory. The exchange had never been about proving dominance. It was about alignment, showing what happens when principles are applied without compromise. Kareem straightened, a faint smile appearing, not of pride, but of appreciation. He extended his hand. I was wrong, he said simply. I can't block that. Bruce shook his hand firmly, respectfully. You could, he answered, if you trained for something different. That stayed with Kareem long after the session ended, not as a story to tell loudly, but as a recalibration. He didn't leave thinking Bruce was unbeatable. He left understanding that mastery wasn't measured by size, reach, or strength, but by how little time you allowed reality to resist you. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar remained still after that exchange, his body upright, his long arms relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable. The space between him and Bruce Lee felt heavier now, not because of hostility, but because something fundamental had shifted. Kareem had expected resistance, maybe force, maybe bravado. What he encountered instead was precision, so complete that it erased the very idea of blocking. There was no contest of strength, no clash of limbs, no moment where height or reach mattered. The movement had ended before his body understood it had begun. For the first time in his athletic life, Kareem realized that his physical advantages, his height, his wingspan, his ability to dominate space, had been rendered irrelevant. Not overcome, not challenged, simply bypassed. The sensation lingered in his nervous system. The absence of impact, the silence where effort should have been, the unsettling awareness that Bruce had controlled the exchange without escalating it. That restraint was more disorienting than force would have been. Kareem had been blocked his entire career by defenders who tried and failed. This was different. This wasn't failure. This was irrelevance. Around them, no one spoke. Fighters, athletes, observers, all sensed that what had just occurred was not a demonstration meant to impress, but a calibration. Bruce Lee hadn't proven superiority. He had revealed a different framework entirely. Kareem stood there, processing something deeper than technique, the realization that reaction time, anticipation, and economy of motion could collapse physical advantages that had defined his identity as an athlete. He didn't say anything yet. He didn't need to. The question forming in his mind wasn't how to stop it, but how to understand it. That silence carried forward, not as an ending, but as an opening. Because what Kareem had just experienced wasn't the conclusion of an encounter. It was the beginning of a shift that would follow him long after this moment. Into training sessions, into conversations, into the way he would think about movement, control, and mastery from that point on. What remained after that day was not a story that traveled fast. There were no headlines, no interviews, no dramatic retellings at the time. The moment lived quietly, stored in the memories of those who understood what they had witnessed. Kareem didn't speak about it publicly for years, not because it embarrassed him, but because it resisted simplification. It wasn't a loss. It wasn't a defeat. It was an exposure of a level of efficiency so refined that strength, reach, and reaction time simply became irrelevant variables. Bruce Lee never framed it as proof of superiority. In his mind, there had been nothing to win. The demonstration wasn't about stopping Kareem. It was about illustrating a principle in its purest form. When movement is reduced to its essence, reaction becomes optional. What most people call speed is often just wasted motion performed faster. What Bruce showed was something else entirely: the removal of delay, the absence of telegraphing, action without announcement. Years later, when audiences saw Bruce and Kareem together on screen, they assumed fiction. They believed the choreography exaggerated reality. But those who knew, who had seen Bruce outside the camera's frame, understood the irony. Film required Bruce to slow down, to exaggerate motion, to make violence readable. Real mastery, as Kareem had learned, was often invisible. It didn't look impressive unless you were standing close enough to be affected by it. Kareem carried that lesson into everything he did afterward, into competition, into preparation, into how he read opponents and space. He understood that the highest level of performance wasn't about overpowering resistance, but arriving before resistance could organize itself. The best defenders weren't the most aggressive, they were the most early. The best movements weren't the biggest, they were the cleanest. That was the real silence that followed. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of recalibration. The kind that happens when an athlete realizes the ceiling they believed in was never real, only familiar. Bruce Lee didn't need to say, "You can't block that." The truth revealed itself without words. And that is why the moment endured. Not because Bruce Lee embarrassed a giant, not because Kareem failed to react, but because, in a few seconds of absolute clarity, one of the greatest athletes in history saw the difference between reacting to the world and arriving before it moves.